One of them's called Oaks, not related, no relation to Phil Oaks. So.
No relation to Phil. I don't know who Phil Oaks is.
Isn't Phil Oaks like a folk singer? Anyway.
Okay, well, maybe relation to Phil Oaks then. I'm not sure.
Oh God, that might be all wrong. Sorry if that's all wrong. Are we recording?
Yes.
Yeah,
don't say anything. Don't say anything bad.
Don't say anything. I've said it all. I've said all I have to say.
yeah, we haven't even started recording.
Oh yeah.
The only thing.
One day you'll catch one of my,
Yeah, one of
tirade.
Yeah. Damn it! He always stops just when I start recording. The only thing I know about one of these guys is that one of them was Mike Gravel's campaign manager.
Great.
So
Great.
I was just like, wow, there's a guy I forgot about. Completely, that feels like 30 years ago now. You know? Like,
wasn't everybody that was working on Mike Gravel's campaign like 16 or something? Wasn't that
you know what? It's possible.
Okay.
He certainly wasn't.
And this guy.
And this guy, who might be 16 again, you know.
Who knows?
The son of famous folk singer Phil Oaks, you know.
If that is indeed the real person.
If that is the truth. You know what? We can just make sure every now and then we stress about like, oh, we really want to like put this thing forward in the best life. We could just make shit up. Yeah. We could just get on here and lie. What are people going to do? You know?
Yeah. Thus far, all of the inaccuracies in the long history of this podcast have all been in good faith, but we could introduce some bad faith inaccuracies if we want.
That's, you know what, episode 150, let's refresh it a little bit. Let's have some bad faith inaccuracies. This guy is the son of Phil Oaks. How about that?
Hey.
All right.
What did we read, Jack?
Yeah, what did we read? Oh my God. I think it was last episode. We've been reading some things that have really been bumming me out. And so as a
you were looking for hope.
Yeah, well,
you were like, I'm gonna go read some Steven Pinker and
yeah, exactly. I talk about bad faith. We read a remedy to that. We read something called The Long Slow Death of Global Development, which, you know, didn't put me in the best mood, I'll be honest with you. This is something I'd seen this kind of passed around Marxist circles in the past. It's a few years old now at this point. I think it was written for American Affairs, not really like necessarily our bag, you know, like that world. Like I think these guys, the authors, again, don't really know much about them, but they seem like well-meaning progressives, obviously. They quote, you know, Mike Davis at some points in here and other kind of like Marxist co-travelers and stuff like that. But basically what this is, I think, is the kind of like progressive mourning of a world that has, you know, it does what it says on the tin. It's a world that has stopped developing its poorer regions. And it's kind of trying to give a postmortem for understanding why that is and what that, mainly like why it happened and what it means for global politics moving forward. And it's interesting because I think kind of like when I started this, I was like, okay, this is clearly being put forward. The main point of this is to kind of like warn of a coming, potentially quite imminent, like large scale collapse of the global economy for a number of different reasons that we'll get into. But honestly, after reading this, like, I think it's kind of hard not to say that collapse hasn't already kind of happened in a lot of places, and in pretty stunning fashion. So, you know, not feeling the best about things at the moment, but I would say this was actually like a really clear elucidation of why these crises have happened. And even though there's, you know, no discussion of the good old law of value or anything like that, it does do a good job of walking you through really what has actually happened in the last, specifically like 50 years, and why that's been really bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I keep saying is that this was just incredibly easy to read, and
we like that.
Really
we like that.
But also has a very clear narrative and a very clear message that it's putting forward. The thesis is there and on the surface. It does that thing that I always appreciate, which is like, here is the narrative that everybody subscribes to, and here is how we're going to disagree with it, and then just proceeds to do what it says it's going to do. So yeah, it's it feels a bit more than just a sort of lament for a lost sort of like liberal global developmentalist view of the sort of like progressive movement toward greater and greater incorporation of the sort of poorer regions of the world into the global economy in a way which sees their economies grow in quite a predictable linear way. Um, I don't know whether, yeah, as I say, I don't know whether it's if they ever subscribe to that kind of vision, it must have been long since sort of like drummed out of them, because they're definitely not in the sort of like in the sort of mainstream theory Steven Pinker style kind of like the world is just getting better. All you have to do is look at the data, look at the stats, and you know we're working toward reducing like all these different markers for like um, poverty and early death and kind of things. The world's just getting better, and they present a narrative of like even for those people recognize that as we've gotten into the 2020s, that sort of view of positive global development has really been shaken. And whilst they agree with, yeah, sure, that sort of narrative is coming off the rails now, their counter argument is, as you say, that like the crisis isn't now, the crisis has been basically ever since the 1980s, you know. And then the other thing, what's quite nice about this, and this ties us in to some extent to the readings that we've done over the past few weeks, is rather than taking quite a sterile kind of like a sort of sterile thesis of how countries develop and trying to imply that as a sort of cookie cutter model to every country, what it actually recognizes is no, like countries are part of a global system. What happens to the sort of like core countries of the global economy is paralleled in the periphery and vice versa. And if there is a sort of failure of, or if there is like a failing progress toward linear sort of economic development in the developing world, it's because of what happens in the sort of global system and not just something that's going wrong in particular countries or what have you. So yeah, the sort of narrative of this was quite familiar to in the context of things we've been reading, but I think actually sort of described in this in a much clearer way, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really good thing just to give to people. Well, yeah, if you want to like really depress your friends who aren't Marxist, you could go ahead and give them this. I mean, there's a really, I think, surprising level of like an understanding of class, I think, in this, and an understanding of, implicit in all of these movements of forms of accumulation throughout the last 50 years and throughout the past century, kind of for what they analyze, like, is the understanding that there's always going to be a wealth transfer from the richer or from the poorer countries to the richer countries, kind of in the face of every crisis, right? And they outline how potentially the forms of extraction that have been going on since kind of like the oil shock, stagflation of like the late 70s, early 80s, like how potentially that kind of has heralded a kind of terminal crisis for the current way of doing things, which we could maybe say is like capitalist, kind of like imperialist exploitation and expropriation. But who knows? I think they're smart enough not to just be like, and here's what's coming next. I think you can make some pretty good guesses as to what the coming kind of like economic and social turmoil looks like, and they do. But at the end of the day, it's like they're not going to come out and be like, and then we're going to have neo-feudalism or whatever. And it's interesting, kind of like what you say, right, about, the just look at the stats kind of people being like, the world is getting, richer. And, just look at how many poor people there were in 1980 versus how many poor people there are now. They make the really excellent point that it's like, that is kind of just because of China and like East Asia in general. Like any kind of statistic that is looking at rates of industrialization and rates of reduction in extreme poverty and literacy, these kind of things, like that is really only on a large scale happening in China, and potentially we're beginning to see with the kind of like demographic decline in China, perhaps the beginning of the end of that, at least in terms of industrialization, things like that. So they make the really astute point where it's you take China out of the picture, actually extreme poverty has been on the rise. If you want to be honest with yourself about employment rates around the world, unemployment and precarious employment has just, skyrocketed in the past 50 years and kind of in the last 20 to 30 years in the poorer countries of the world. And again, yeah, like this has kind of been a theme, I think, of the last few episodes, which is like trying to get past this methodological nationalism. They really do view the global economy as a global economy. And they're, yeah, in this kind of short essay, it's just really, I think, well, kind of, they did a really good job of getting past those kind of like, just look at America, just look at China, just look at Europe. They understand that the global economy, to speak in truisms, is a global economy. And yeah, it's to their credit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder, now, as I was saying, like there's a degree to which they're fighting against an effort to sort of apply one theory of development to countries outside of any consideration of how what else is happening in the global system. And to my understanding, the way you could describe that is the idea that you take a developing country, largely like agrarian or whatever, peasant, and then you the primary route to development is like through industrialization and urbanization. And they're saying that like, well, they in some respects, that what I in the early stages of this essay, something that I found quite interesting was how they were kind of differentiating or trying to describe the idea of a like a manufacturing path to developing a national economy. And they do seem to subscribe to the idea that that is the best way to develop an economy if you want to do it in if you want to develop an economy toward something analogous to a middle tier or even a developed country kind of economy. That's the best way to do it, and they outline in quite interesting fashion like reasons why you would do that, because like well, primarily because it's the one which can bear the most sustainable and the largest degree of sort of progressive, in a linear sense, progressive growth. Like it's impossible to sort of like grow on the basis of agricultural output or like raw resource harvesting, just in the sense that they're limited by what you're the sort of almost like organic constraints, like how much land can you grow crops on, or how much raw resources do you actually have to exploit. So they do sort of suggest that like, okay, yeah, there is some logic perhaps to having this developmentalist idea of the route you have to take is through industrialization, but actually what they say is that's not the route. That's not a route that's like clearly open to all countries. Industrialization, as you say, Jack, is like massively skewed toward China and the sort of the far east economies. Partly that is because of all of the other different elements of the global world economic system that are intervening to muddy the waters of a sort of like clear path that everybody's able to take. So I would suggest, at least in the first sections of this essay, that's the narrative, right? It's like there is this idea that there is one system that sort of fits all scenarios, but in actual fact, because of every country is included in the global world economic system in some way or other, the operation of that system interferes with any sort of like sort of standard path to development. So there is no real clear way to do that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's kind of I guess how the main building block that their entire argument is built on, right? Which is that why has there been this kind of like massive slowdown in the development of periphery or just like the poorer countries of the world? And it is because, I think you're right to highlight this actually. Like they make a good roadmap, very broad, abstract roadmap for how a country goes from like relatively poor to middling income, or even like, in China's case, like a global superpower. And I think the way that they phrase it is really good, because they say something like there's no widely replicable way to develop a country that doesn't run through manufacturing. But, they're able to do what you say, right? They're able to point to like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states in general, or Norway as being countries that have more or less kind of just avoided that and have become relatively well-off countries. basically just because mass resource extraction. No, I mean, that resource extraction is a very different type of the resource extraction of a country that's trying to export timber or export, like rare earth minerals or something like that, because Norway and Saudi Arabia just have absolutely like unfathomably large deposits of fossil fuels, right? And yeah, that's one thing capitalism obviously really likes. But for them, like as you're saying, yeah, absolutely, like manufacturing and industry is the one way that where you're able to like really quickly soak up very large, relatively like unskilled and uneducated workforces into a really profitable industry that, for a number of reasons, like it's much easier to kind of like absorb crises if you have like developed manufacturing as opposed to like, okay, suddenly, the market for coffee has gone and the whole country like goes into economic turmoil, right? Like, and also, in a more Marxist sense, like it's much easier to kind of ramp up the productivity of labor in manufacturing than it is in agriculture, where again, like as you say, like there are these ecological limits where we had the so-called like green revolution, where suddenly after World War II, all of this fixed capital from the war was put to use to kind of like make, synthetic inputs like pesticides and fertilizers and all of this stuff, as well as like tractors and stuff. But that's kind of it. Once you got past that, you kind of can't really ramp up the productivity of agriculture anymore. At least, it's crop dependent, but right, like if you look at something like making shoes or something like that, like there's generally been a kind of development in manufacturing where, okay, now everybody moves out of the Rust Belt because we're able to like invest in factories over here in China, or we're able to move to like, somewhere else. But yeah, this is all to basically just say that this is their broad abstract roadmap where they recognize the countries that haven't done this, but they say there's no replicable way to kind of like make a poor country relatively richer that doesn't go through industry. And, there's all of these ideas about how service-led economies can do that, as well as obviously like raw raw commodity exports, which we've already talked about, but like services as well. It's very self-limiting. You can't really up productivity of those things. And I think also like when you just think about the services that are around now, like they're just so dependent on uncontrollable whims of the market. Like, okay, suddenly thousands and thousands and thousands of people are employed in either like the Philippines or in different places around the world where there are low labor power costs for labor power to just like scroll through loads of data from Facebook. And then, okay, now suddenly those jobs go away. And okay, now they're back, but now they're leaving the Philippines and they're going to like Ethiopia or something like that, right? Like service things like that are really difficult to base an entire economy on. And again, like, yeah, as in the case with China was able to kind of see this massive jump, partially through state power, obviously. That was a huge part of it. But also just because it just invested massively in manufacturing. Yeah.
It's quite interesting, sort of like the way they explore the idea of labor. They obviously don't have like a Marxist understanding, but there's some of it there in the sense that like recognizing that you have to deploy large amounts of labor to develop sort of like a productive economy. And one of their, as you say, one of their like it sort of skirts against something we've come up against when we've talked about agriculture. The sort of like diminishing quantity of labor in agriculture, something that they recognize is happening. So yeah, I guess this like this essay is really good for offering a sort of like very clear historical narrative. I think that's the thing that I really appreciated of it the most. And then it's a historical narrative that intersects, as you were implying before, like intersects a narrative and a history of global crisis, global economic development, boom and booms, and then also sort of busts in the form of global crises. And it's almost that sort of that functions as the kind of meta narrative that is actually explaining the developmental trajectory in all of these countries that they explore, and what options are available and what isn't, and what options are taken away, and what options are largely taken away by changes or demands in the global economy brought about by boom or bust cycles rather than like anything endogenous to a particular economy, I suppose. So yeah, they make this interesting point that like there was a golden age of global development, but it's not the kind of like modern one, the modern narrative that we talk about of like the golden age is now, or the golden age was the first 2 decades of the 20th century when infant mortality was falling to this degree and sort of like per person purchasing power was up to this degree, or whatever statistic is thrown out as being a useful metric of sort of how well the global economy is doing. But they actually say no, like the golden age was for them defined by a period between like the 50s and the 80s, and they sort of point out an irony that a lot of these countries were, by these modern metrics, relatively poor at this point in time. And what's interesting is all the advantages they see them as having are actually things that stem from the global world economic system and not from the particular nature of these countries themselves. So, and what's interesting as well, I guess, is the way this sort of golden age that they describe also ties into like the sort of global boom, post-war boom cycle of the global economy. And I guess in some ways as well, it's not really explored in the piece, and we don't have to explore it very heavily here, but like we can think back to like like regimes, like national developmental regimes that popped up in Iran or parts of South America or Egypt or whatever, that actually had to be put down quite violently by CIA and whoever else. I think that sort of historical political narrative also fits into this sort of like global economic one in a way, which is quite interesting if you want to pair the two things together.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't even thought of that, but you're absolutely right. And that's actually really interesting, specifically in the case of like Iran, where it's, not only are you not going to do the normal manufacturing developmental path, actually we're going to force you into like raw commodity exporting, but it's going to be entirely owned by the British and the Americans. It's just like, oh wow.
Yeah.
Like
we're going to put a king in charge.
Yeah. It is interesting though, like, again, like this speaks to their analysis, I think, where they're able to recognize, the ways in which that was the path not taken. But then there are also like other examples where it's like the Ivory Coast in here, where they talk a lot about, and I honestly didn't know too much about the Ivory Coast, like economic history, or just history in general, I guess. But they talk about how there was this brief period where there was like widely considered by bourgeois economists that there was like, the miracle of the Ivory Coast, where it was this country that was Western aligned and was really seeing a boon in its kind of like manufacturing as well as its like economic exports. And it was really on its way to becoming this like developed country in the kind of like, more like bourgeois meaning of that term, economically developed, I should say. And then suddenly with, the crisis, I suppose, like, as we've said, like in the 70s, and then the like Volcker shocks of 79 through like 81, this was all really abruptly brought to a close. And this is kind of like the turning point for them, for where really you stop getting that kind of like bourgeois dream of, development and everybody, a rising tide lifts all boats, where you just actually start to see collapse in the places like the Ivory Coast, as well as in the places, just like broadly everywhere. Like I was going to say mainly in periphery countries, but we know that that's obviously not true, right? Like there's large scale like economic collapse in the United States, in Europe, everywhere. It's just that obviously, like, brings me back to like the Walter Rodney that we read like a million episodes ago, where he was like, the development of the core countries is always tied to the underdevelopment of the periphery countries. He doesn't use those terms, but that's like broadly what he means. Like, to save capital, there was not only a large capitalism, I suppose I should say, like there was not only a large transfer of wealth from the working classes of the periphery or of the core countries to the kind of like, neoliberalizing like ruling classes, but it was also just a massive transfer of wealth again from the periphery countries to the core countries, again, the ruling classes of those core countries. And it's for more or less exactly the same reasons that we're familiar with it happening in our kind of countries, like meaning the United States and England, right? Where it's like the central banks were all given the mandate, which is still basically just their only mandate, although maybe it's changing with Trump. Like, all you do is control inflation. Don't care about anything else. We need to control inflation. Who gives a fuck about unemployment? All of the kind of like old heads that remembered the Great Depression were like put in the back. They were told you can collect your paychecks, but you will have nothing to do with economic policy going forward. Who cares about unemployment? And central banks, beginning obviously with the United States, were told just control inflation. So that's what Volcker did. You have the massive increase in interest rates, and you have the attendant drop in inflation, but then a massive rise in unemployment and a completely like crashed commodity markets all over the world, right? So this kind of leads to what they call a kind of like premature deindustrialization all over the world and everywhere again, other than China, and a premature, not even like a premature, but just like with the kind of rise in agricultural productivity, you also get a de-agriculturalization. So suddenly there are just huge swaths of the working people of the planet who just have nowhere to go anymore. And this leads to not just like economic crisis, this leads to like political collapse and crises in places that were ostensibly developing, you know, something that I think is pretty under discussed is what they call like the Great War of Africa here, which is just like all of the attendant, you know, we think like independent wars and struggles that we just think of as always happening in specifically like sub-Saharan Africa, places like Rwanda and Uganda and Democratic Republic of the Congo. They're all like a lot of these wars are still ongoing, you know, like these were all directly a result of kind of the crash, the global crash of this period, right? And so you get the Rwandan genocide, you get wars in Uganda again, like all over these different places, and you get kind of like the abrupt halt of development in all of these countries, and just like a complete what political control there was in these countries, which obviously like there was to develop these places, it just abruptly collapsed, and we're still left with the fallout of that. Like they're able to really easily, or not really easily, but they're able to like really do a good job of connecting like modern day Al Shabaab and Boko Haram with like, you know, the Rwandan genocide and with, you know, the rise of kind of like the pink tide in South America and all of this different stuff, all is kind of stemming from different reactions to this really abrupt halt in global development. And is kind of the reason I said at the beginning of this, like maybe that collapse that we're all worried about, like kind of already happened in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say to that, but the first thing that jumps to mind is like, you can imagine some kind of like chauvinist saying that all of this tumult at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century in developing parts of the world could be blamed on the kind of like supposed backwardness of some of these countries, or, you know, somebody might say cultures or something. But in actual fact, if you read the narrative of this essay, what they're saying is no, it's like it's actually inclusion in the global modern world system which results in these sort of truly horrific sort of like histories of many of these countries. So it's not necessarily about being backwards, but actually a degree of developedness which has been stifled in some way, I suppose. It's really interesting what you say. One of the things that struck me most about this was some of those aspects of parallels of the economic history between the developed countries and the sort of developing countries in this, particularly this idea of mass deindustrialization, sort of sweeping the world at a point in time in the sort of mid 80s, when you imagine like the destruction of the Rust Belt, or the sort of like closing of coal mines and industrial areas of England or France or whatever. And the idea that that was paralleled by a similar deindustrialization of various developing countries across the world, South America and Africa and other areas. And then the really interesting thing is that like this is all the result of Western efforts to deal with economic crisis. that you know may or may not sort of like solve the problem in that they restabilize Western economies, but they have this sort of tragic knock-on effect of also massively destabilizing the economic systems of um, developing world countries as well. I mean, the idea of the sort of like the history of the Volcker shocks and the requirement to stop runaway inflation in America, having this knock-on effect of massively decreasing global commodity prices, by which I mean like raw materials commodity prices, um, being this other sort of paralleling aspect, I suppose, of like the same effect in a developed economy functions potentially to through shock, through crisis, to revivify the economy, but in other parts of the world, it just has this massively destructive effect. Um, Something that I wonder whether I should try and clarify a little bit is that, like, earlier on when I was saying that, like, their argument is there's like no route to developing an economy based on the back of exploiting natural resources of a country. That's not quite as cut and dry as may have sort of first implied, because there's an interesting historical paralleling in this narrative about the experience of developing world countries selling or basing their economies on like raw material sales on a commodities market, a global commodities market, in the context of this sort of golden age of development. That could be paired very nicely with a developmental process that could have proved quite fruitful in developing these countries into modern economies, if you're in a position to like if you have a strong state which is able to sort of like govern the sale of these things and tax them and reinvest them in developmental ways, which is, I understand what was happening in the sort of like 50 to 1980 sort of golden age period. There's another period of this history in the kind of like early 2010s rather, where a lot of countries had to sort of fallen back into this mold of running their economies based on commodity exports. I suppose Venezuela is the classic example of like one which didn't diversify itself to a degree that made it less vulnerable to shocks of this nature. A similar shock of which came in the sort of 2015 kind of era, and this sort of had similar effects in destabilizing the developing world economy. But there's a lot of things that in this essay they tie together as being essential to being actually able to function and develop a country. And to a degree, seemingly the most important thing is like having quite a strong unitary state, which is not sort of exposed to the pressures of the developing world countries in a sort of political economic sense, and not having commodities markets which are controlled strongly by sort of like rentier classes that are able to sort of skim the profits off the top and immediately sort of extract them from the country. So one of the things that sort of goes in line with this destabilizing of the golden age developing world economy is sort of quite a strong destabilizing of that country's sort of like government, state regime, creating circumstances whereby they don't really hold a true monopoly of the use of violence in a way that like a developed state would. But also you get this whole process of like developing world economies being more indebted to like the IMF and that kind of thing, so that they're more exposed to the political economic demands of developing world countries, particularly in the context of the demand to liberalize your economy, in the sense of like what we identify as sort of like neoliberalism, uh, which for me is like quite another interesting example of like again how like trends in the developed world global economic system like have an impact on the developing world in a way which implies or makes evident the fact that these are not two separate systems at all, but just like one contiguous thing, I guess.
Yeah, that's really well put. You know what that made me think is like, I think you're absolutely right to like focus on the importance of the kind of form, the state form that was in place when some of these countries were able to like undergo semi-successful developmental regimes based off of raw commodity exports. Because like, you know, Norway's the perfect example of this, right? Where it's just
Mm-hmm.
like people love to go, the Nordic model, they have it all figured out. Everybody there is so happy. Why can't we just be like Norway? It's like, well, the way you become like Norway is you have social democrats in power and then they discover enormous oil reserves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Norway went from being one of, if not the poorest countries in Europe to just like overnight incredibly wealthy and had all of this money to spend, and it spent it on developing, mainly like the social fabric, I guess. But or you do like the Saudi model where it's like, then you invest in Candy Crush. It's like,
Well, I mean that in that instance, I guess the survival of your government regime becomes essential to
absolutely, yeah.
the first world economies in a way that actually makes you indispensable, and they'll defend you no matter what
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of horrendous things you
absolutely.
do. You know.
But I mean, also what that just made me think is like, in order to kind of have these developmental, a lot of like the really successful developmental regimes that really took poor countries to kind of like wealthy status, like
Mm-hmm.
you had to have forms of state control that I think really clearly like broke the rules of international like order, right? And like China is the obvious example of this, right? Like basic, and the Soviet Union, like, until it collapsed, right? Like you had to have countries that were just willing to break the rules of the game. And the way that they did that was just by like doing what, Kerensky's government couldn't do, and doing what the kind of like Kuomintang couldn't really do, which is create a country, first of all. Like that's the one thing you have to create: a China, create a, Soviet Republic, I guess. Unify it, and then, through some like pretty horrific practices, like develop your country. And that's like to varying degrees, because like Norway was able to do it, but like kind of like soft breaking the rules. It's like, wait a minute, you have like a social democracy, like nobody's homeless. What the hell? How did you guys
Mm-hmm.
manage to do that, right? But yeah, I don't know. That's just very interesting. And like the corollary, I guess, to that in terms of this collapse is that where you do have raw commodity resourcing economies that aren't really like in developed nations, like now you just have forms of state control that don't really control much other than relatively corrupt, and are just skimming off the top, and are just kind of like rentier elites who just like, you know, it's like, forms of control that may or may not exist in a lot of the like precious mineral extraction in like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Like kind of parts of the country are just controlled by war bands. Parts of them are controlled by just like, people who are just like sell to the highest apple bidder or whatever. Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
grim.
One of the things I was trying to think, one of the things that's like I feel like they a question that they ask but don't really answer. They answer it to some degree. The question that I had when I was reading this is why China is successful in this when other countries weren't, And I was trying to think back to my Schwong, but I can't really remember what narrative
So to
Schwong give
speak.
to like. But I think at some degree you just gave it right to like China was this kind of like country outside of the global system that was able to develop at least to some degree on its own, and then insert itself at the exact right moment when the the West was looking to divest itself of sort of labor intensive industries, manufacturing, um, but where there was still some scope for growth in global production, and where you can introduce a large enough body of workers at a cheap enough a cheap enough production cost, um, that you can then sort of like revivify growth in the economy to some degree. Um, one of the I don't really I'm sort of like speculating now, but one of the things that like I was thinking about a little bit, one of the things that maybe this essay is lacking for its lack of Marxism to some extent is you could probably get from sort of Marxist understanding of how the global economy is developed, a sort of an explanation as to why you can't just like transfer production from China to other parts of the world in a way which means that you can have cheaper and cheaper production. And I guess it's probably just because China has played it out. You know, they've extracted all of the sort of value creating potential of these industries, and now they're moving into a phase of automation where like you can't it wouldn't be enough to just introduce a load of new cheap labor into the process to actually find new growth, because these technologies have moved into a degree of organic composition where it's more machine than human beings
more
anymore,
machine than man.
Machine than man, exactly.
Yeah, and
anyway,
I mean,
so that's my lay Marxist musing.
Your injection of Marxism into everything. I mean, you're right too, and it's also just like that's why companies like Apple and every successful capitalist company, like it's why they just have fucking millions and billions and bajillions of dollars just sitting doing fucking nothing, right? Because there's just no reason for capitalists to reinvest in production in a lot of these sectors, right? Like even I think in some of the like endnotes, maybe it was endnotes, some of the like ultra left stuff, there was maybe it was Schwang actually. They're talking about, sure, production, they use this metaphor of like smog and dust to basically be like, where, capitalism is this global system. It doesn't really recognize borders insofar as it will just go where it needs to go to accumulate the fastest. And they use this metaphor of like, at once, the smog was around the Rust Belt in America, and then it left there and, it moved to China, and they're like, and, it might move to Nigeria one day. But it's like, reading this, it's like, it's probably not. It's probably not. Nigeria and different countries like that seem primed, where they have like, large demographic growth in places where that's something we haven't touched on, where, more core countries and definitely China are about to experience like pretty abrupt demographic decline. Places like sub-Saharan Africa are actually the reverse. The conditions really just, as you say, like because of the organic composition of capital, because of the falling rate of profit, there's just not necessarily reason for capitalists with their little investment funds to go, oh, you know what, it actually would be, what they do is they just go, it's less risky to invest in fucking open AI than it, if it doesn't say anything to say, than it would be to invest in like making shoes better or making tables better or something like that. Because, you just look at the level of risk and you just go, it doesn't make sense. It's why nothing, I forget, what was her name? The economist who did the thing about the iPhone. It's like why nothing in the iPhone was
Mazzucato.
like, yeah, exactly. Mariana Mazzucato. Like why nothing in the iPhone was made and designed by Apple. It was just designed
or even by
a
private company. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
there is something about their narrative about population changes which is particularly depressing, because it's like, here are all these countries where population, that sort of like the population is not reproducing itself, and there's going to be population decline, and there's going to be an aging population, and here are all the reasons why it's going to be bad for those countries. And then here are all these countries that are having like still having population booms, and they're going to end up with massive youth populations in the 2050s.
And here's why that's bad.
And here's why it's terrible. These countries, it's like, come on, like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is the time where we start tracking some of these threads into what their predictions are for the future, and why it's all terrible.
Why it's all terrible. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the demographic decline stuff, again, where there was demographic growth, mass demographic growth, like in places like, the birthplace of it all, at least in terms of its industry, like the north of England, right? Like where there were these massive proletarian surpluses, there was the textile industry to soak them all up, and where there were, and so on, and like, obviously China again, like where several hundred million people were just suddenly thrown into the global manufacturing economy. Like there was industry there. There was industry there to make cheap commodities, and to a large extent still is. But because of the way demographic decline is going, and in demographic decline, I suppose I mean like the demographic decline of the quote unquote like developed core countries, but then also the demographic increase in places like sub-Saharan Africa. And yeah, why there's just not really industry to soak these people up. And yeah, I suppose if we want to start drawing those threads together, they say quite rightly, like when you have a lot of young people with no economic, what's the word, like prospects, and a lot of free time, that's generally where you get not necessarily revolution, but you certainly get large scale unease and rebellion. And when you have like this collapse of the state control monopoly on violence, you start getting these groups like Al-Shabaab, which they rightly point out means the youth, and you start getting places that are attempting to kind of like run counter to these methods of control in pretty reactionary ways on the extreme, and in pretty destructive ways, I suppose, not in the just in terms of just like, what was it we talked about way back? Teng Ping. Wonder if they're still doing that in China, laying flat, where it's just a lot of people just doing nothing, because what are you going to do? Like, you can't do much. So,
yeah. I mean, there are some many particularly sad sections of this piece, but one of the ones that hit me the most is like the description that they give of the experience of being jobless in some of these places, or like underemployed, and the sort of like effort to, you got massive numbers of people applying to like fewer and fewer actual like sort of like quote unquote like good jobs, I guess, and obviously then you get more and more people pulled into the peripheries of economies, into precarity and precarious work, and as you say, like in the most extreme cases, pulled into like para-state terrorist organizations, or maybe in Central and South America into drug cartels. You pair that with like as we were saying before, like the destabilization of the ability of many of these states to function as unitary states, where they can control their borders and have a monopoly on the use of violence, and control their elites and have good elites in a way that allows for long-term economic sort of like developmental planning, and you sort of like get a real recipe for catastrophe, I guess.
Yeah, or just at the very least, nothing good happening.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of their harbingers, is this kind of like changes in demography, and then their other one obviously is just like the ever-present impending climate crisis, which is just like going to wreak havoc in a lot of these places, just making like, and they I mean, it already is, right? It's already what stands behind quite a lot of like global mass migrations, and there were also already signs of like crop failures, and I don't know, like signs of the ecological crisis having this massive global system effect on the rest of the world system, in terms of the economy and in terms of the movement of people, and
and obviously like the reaction of those core countries that people are attempting to migrate to migrants. They make a lot to say about that. Maybe what I'll go back quickly, because I think this is worth just reading in full. It's one of their paragraphs where they talk about the kind of service sector and this kind of like, Mike Davis, like Planet of Slums inspired kind of like sudden increase in the quote unquote like lumpen proletariat or whatever, or just precarious unemployment, where they say almost by default, this surplus labor was absorbed into a nebulous economic stratum, which economists categorize quite euphemistically as part of the service sector. In the public imagination, the standard archetypes of these service workers are the call center workers and IT professionals of Bangalore or Manila. Blah, 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 blah. But far more common is the relatively skilled labor pool, is a different, more plebeian variety. The low productivity work, overwhelmingly informal, casual, and irregular, that has come to define the social landscapes of poor world cities. The Dutch sociologist Jan Bremen In his study of employment in southern Gujarat, calls the workers of this informal sector wage hunters and gatherers. The unlicensed taxi drivers, roadside fruit peddlers, freelance porters, squeegee men and women, biddy rollers, beggars, rag pickers, clothing resellers, small time scammers and thieves, bazaar porters, and general purpose unskilled jobbers, who constitute the majority of the populations of cities everywhere from Kabul to Cabinda to Managua. These low skilled service workers are far more numerous than their high skilled formalized counterparts. About 90% of the hundreds of millions of jobs created in India since its liberalization process began in 1991, for instance, have been in the quote unquote informal sector, not in the much vaunted IT industry. And, that's like that's the extreme, which is unfortunately, like I say, it's the extreme statistically. It's much more common than what I'm about to say, but like, all of this stuff exists in the core countries too, just not to the same extreme. But I mean, like, most people work precarious jobs and also have to do fucking gig work, to stay alive. Like, yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it's what I went back to about like, this massive transfer of wealth being necessary under capitalism from periphery to core countries. But it's also the idea that like, everything wreaked on these countries is always by the core is always going to come back in one form or another to haunt the core countries. It'll just be the workers of those core countries that it's being haunted by, right? And it's a really interesting question, one that I'm not sure that we've really ever kind of like grappled with or attempted to grapple with on the show, which is like, how do you mobilize these people quickly becoming the majority of the proletarian population to, socialist political activity? It's something that we've touched on in terms of like precarious workers in core countries, but it's much more extreme in places like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or something like that, right? And it's a huge question, and it's like, what is it that draws people to criminal organizations or radical groups as opposed to like socialist groups? Reading this, I was like, well, maybe it's just because the socialist groups don't actually present themselves as a radically opposed to the current order in the way that these other groups do, just in a very nihilistic fashion, right? It's interesting, that line between like, I don't know, nihilism and anti-state violence versus like, a more positive version of that. It's interesting.
That we won't name.
Which we won't name. Yeah, exactly. And are against. But, it's just like, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one. It's like, clearly the want is there for something like that. It's just like, why have those forms not made themselves more known, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. One of the things that did start to coalesce in my head whilst I was reading this to some extent was maybe it's something that's fairly obvious and known, but like for me, I now sort of understand why it was that so many sort of like pseudo or partially left-wing political movements in the global south also took the form of sort of like nationalist organizations or nationalist political parties or nationalist projects, because like in the context of obviously in the context of coming out of the sort of like legacy of imperialism, but also in the context of being a developing world country in an effort to develop elites or develop state capacity that can like build a regime which is fit for what they describe as the sort of golden age of development, is able to actually develop in a way which is well-rounded and gets out of some of the traps of just being stuck in commodity production without developing the rest of the economy, or doesn't fall into the pitfalls of a sort of rentier elite skimming off all of the profits from these things. I sort of now understand why both nationalism and socialism ended up being paired together, because they sort of like, I don't know, like had a sort of potential joint trajectory, I suppose, at least in staving off the sort of like neo-colonialist machinations of the Western powers and trying to maintain some degree of national state capacity and coherence, I guess. I don't know what that tells us about now. I guess I guess in the modern context, you'd somehow have to pair sympathetic.
You were mid flow. Internet dropped out. You're mid flow. It's a question of.
What was I saying?
It's a question of.
It's a question of. I think maybe what I was saying was, it's a question of pairing a developed sort of like a sympathetic political project in the developed world with similarly minded political projects in the developing world to, like, I don't know, develop maybe not state, but state plus class capacity to, I don't know, great socialism or something. Blah, blah, blah.
I mean, it's going to be a question of, like, depending on what form that takes. Let's say you got the 1917, but this time good. This time it works, like road to power or whatever, even like a social democratic road to power. You would need to be able to show in whatever country that was, or whatever geographical location that was, you'd need to be able to show that a socialist mode of production is not only like the only way to do things, but actually the only one capable of being, I was going to say more productive, but like productive at all. Mm-hmm. That is one way of doing it. Otherwise, I think probably you're just kind of looking at when the immiseration levels get closer to being equal, and there's no longer a, like, core working classes of the core benefiting from the kind of like mass immiseration of peripheral countries. I don't know. Are those? I guess are two options.
To some extent, you foretold some of this earlier, in the sense that there is a parallel decline in the living standards of people in the quote unquote developed world, as well as the sort of developing world, I suppose. So, like, as you say, if there's a global immiseration, maybe we can have a sort of global revolutionary immiseration thesis where.
Yeah, I mean, you know what else has kind of stunned me is, like, talking about, necessarily needing socialism to, like, overcome these problems, like, and planning of some kind. Like, it's really shocking reading this, and the stuff about the Volcker shock and all of that. Like, the tools that the ruling classes have at their disposal to deal with these crises are, like, they're so overblown. They're, like, so minimal. And, like, the Volcker shock stuff really just shows you that they're just like, there's one thing that they can do to affect, like, macro level economics, and it kind of worked for a little while, but also led, just kicking the can further down the road and making the can much larger and harder to kick. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's the thing central banks can do. Or you can just bail out companies and hope it, another credit crisis doesn't happen again, or you can just pump more money into the economy, and or you can just become a kleptocrat, which is increasingly what they're actually doing, and just, like, whatever, we'll just fucking steal shit. Like, fuck it. Yeah.
I guess I feel like the thesis that's put forward by the authors of this essay, I may be misrepresenting them here, is that there's the possibility of some kind of rekindling that golden age form of development, putting back in place some of the state and international structures that allowed for that to exist. Like, they want to go back to, in a lot of ways, it's the same as sort of many sort of Keynesian liberal economists or something that want to think that it's possible to recreate the post-war boom simply through sort of like macroeconomic
we're all in it together.
Yeah, measures of some kind or other. We just need a new Bretton Woods. I don't know. Obviously, as Marxists, what we would say is that there's a deeper level of economic crisis here that's an inevitable outcome of how capitalism operates, and we have to sort of deal with that and go beyond capitalism if we want to.
Yeah. I mean, how, like, I hate to say it after we've just said how good this article is, but like, how absurd do the last two paragraphs seem now as opposed to when this was written, where they're like, the two things we need to do are reindustrialize America. It's like, okay. And we need to, the one thing that even then would have been insane, where they're like, we need to put the state monopoly of violence back in the hands of the state. It's like, okay, like, I've never heard anyone use that term like that to be like, we just need more state violence. But
and you're going to get both of those things in America right now.
Literally, that's exactly what I was thinking.
You're going to get the onshoring of industrial jobs without there actually being any jobs, because they're just going to onshore all the machines, and they're not actually going to onshore any of the people that work at the machines. And then, ICE. That's what you get.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. I was literally thinking, I was like, well, they got their progressive dream with Trump. You know what I mean? It's like, there you go. We got the only way to bring back industry, or to attempt to, and almost certainly wind up failing at it, is to just fucking deport loads of people, crush wages. Yeah, exactly. It's just like, yes, the solution. Hopefully these guys are Marxists by now. Hopefully they figured it out.
Clearly 3 years is a long time. So, let's look them up.
Yeah, what are you gonna do? Yeah,
but good essay. Well done.
Good essay. It was really, really good. I did really enjoy this. And the one last thing I'll say, just to touch on the climate stuff that you mentioned, I think there was a good understanding in this of like climate chaos and ecological, destruction not being a like abrupt thing. Like, I remember when I was a kid, I always used to think that sea level rise was always going to happen at once. You know what I mean? Like, it's just going to be like
the day after tomorrow kind of
scenario. Day after tomorrow, literally, exactly. And I was like, God, when's that going to happen? Stay away from the beach. Like, Jesus. But like, they have a really good understanding in this of those effects not just being cumulative, but also quite chaotic. Mm-hmm. The way that they describe the effects that climate change and biodiversity crises and stuff like that have on the global economy was a really nuanced one, where it's like, you're not just going to get droughts forever. You're not just going to get floods forever. In some cases, obviously, will be quite abrupt, like in Bangladesh or something like that, with sea level rise. But like, generally, it's just going to be chaos in the sense of like, in the systems theory sense. Like, it's just going to be an unrecognizable pattern that is not controlled and is not like predictable. So, yeah, great.
I guess one could probably fall into the trap of imagining that climate change is something that's going to completely derail the global system, when actually it's going to be just another factor that intersects it. It's just going to be something that, like, it's an element of the global world system rather than like an externality. It's actually, it becomes internal to the whole operation of the thing, and its effects are going to be complicated and distributed in ways that we can't necessarily tell, and will appear in forms that might not be clear necessarily as well, because they might take the form of a migrant crisis, or I don't know, some other form of economic or social crisis, rather than, I mean, that's already what's happening, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? And like, again, just like the inability of the more kind of like soft hand of capital on the like liberal progressive end. Like, remember the migrant caravan stuff, when that was like the biggest news, and it was like, it's like the Falklands War, where it's like the battleships are getting closer today. No, they're a little bit closer. They're a little bit closer. It was like that, but it's like the liberal response to the kernel of truth being like more or less climate and economic refugees trying to make their way to a more prosperous life. Like, whereas the, fascist wing of capital was like, calling them vermin or whatever, and wanting to like turn them away and put them in camps. Like, the liberal thing was just pretend. No, that's not, what's he talking about? Fake news. There's no a migrant caravan. Please, you believe there's a migrant caravan? And it's just like, I got an inability to kind of like come to terms with the modern state of the world. I mean, I don't know, maybe we don't get into this too much, but it's just like thinking about the ways in which collapse, this really got me thinking about the ways in which collapse will manifest, because it did make me realize, like, I used to be a big Rome guy, and it's like, at what point did the average Roman realize they were living through a collapse? And it's like in the United States, I think really suddenly people have realized, oh, things actually aren't getting better for the first time in a really long time. And with this, it's like, well, that collapse actually happened for the majority of the world's population a while ago. But then if you really like, I don't know, you're definitely right about the ways in which climate crises will manifest themselves on a global scale, but also there could just be things that are just abrupt terminal crises. Like, I know I just said that sea level rise is going to happen all at once, but there is going to be a point where millions and millions of people have to leave Bangladesh, and how's capital going to deal with that?
Mhm.
You know, like, so yeah. Buy loads of canned food. No, I'm just kidding. Get an allotment. That's
not a terrible idea.
Yeah, exactly.
The cans aren't going to last,
This is where we start talking about, keep seeds. This is where we start talking about our prepper kits that are available on Patreon for low price of a monthly rent, please. Great. All right.
Well, feeling optimistic yet?
I think it's time to go back to like social democracy. Because in the new year, I'm going to need something like that. Go back to the
we're going to read some cats. We're going to read the Roads of Power.
Exactly.
Great. Well, I'm not sure when this is. Are we in the new year now from the listeners' timeline? I don't know. Who knows?
If we put this out when it's supposed to come out, it'll be Boxing Day, I think. But who's listening to podcasts on Boxing Day? Either Boxing Day or the second.
Maybe we'll save it for the. Anyway,
this is for
the. Yeah. Well, regardless, thank you everybody for listening. Have an excellent solstice and all that. kind of
solstice
stuff.
is soon, isn't it?
There you go. Yeah.
Have a happy new year.
Yeah.
What a thing to say after this episode. Have a happy new year.
You don't know how many more of them you get in.
Yeah, exactly. It'll all be great. Just do socialism. We'll be fine.
Very nice. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, Dan, happy 150th. How about that?
Is that where we're at?
That's where we're at. This is 150. Yeah, Jesus.
Yeah. Great. Well, happy 150th podcast, Jack. Let's do a few more, shall we?
Let's do a few more. All right. See everybody later.
Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us if we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.